The desert sun burned low on the horizon, painting the mesas in fire and blood. The wagon train had been pushing hard since dawn, the settlers eager to reach safer ground before nightfall. Evelyn Harper, only 19 and already hardened by months of travel, clutched the side of the jolting wagon as the wheels creaked and rattled over rock. Dust coated her dress, her hair, even her lashes, but she said nothing. Every family knew that silence was safer than complaint when miles still stretched between them and their destination. The journey west had not been easy. Supplies had run thin, 2 oxen had perished from heat and thirst, and Evelyn's father had grown ill. Her mother insisted they press on, that fortune and farmland lay just beyond the barren miles. Evelyn wanted to believe her. But the deeper they pushed into Apache lands, the more her stomach twisted with unease. There were whispers among the settlers, tales of ambushes, of travelers vanishing into the desert without a trace. Evelyn had tried to dismiss them as campfire exaggerations, until the attack came. It happened without warning. One moment, the wagon train groaned forward beneath the crimson sky. The next came the piercing cry of war whoops from the ridges above. The horses reared in terror, oxen bellowed, and panic erupted. Evelyn barely had time to scream before arrows whistled through, the air thudding into wood, into flesh. Men shouted and fired rifles wildly, but the warriors were swift, shadows against stone, their movements as fluid as the wind itself. Evelyn's mother pulled her close, shielding her body as the wagon lurched. She remembered the sickening crash, of it tipping sideways, the crack of wood, the pain as she struck the ground. Then, chaos. Figures loomed over her, fierce and painted, their eyes blazing with something she could not name. Strong hands seized her arms. She kicked, she fought, but her strength was nothing compared to theirs. Her father's voice cried out once, then was swallowed by gunfire. Her mother's grasp slipped away in the struggle. Evelyn screamed until her throat tore, but no one answered. The fight was over as swiftly as it began. Dust settled over broken wagons. The bodies of men sprawled in the sand, women and children huddled in terror. Those who survived were herded together like cattle. The Apaches did not kill them all. Some were bound, others struck down. Evelyn's wrists were tied with rawhide, her breath ragged, her chest heaving. Her mind reeled. Why had she been spared? What awaited her now? The warriors spoke in a tongue she could not understand, harsh and rhythmic. Their leader barked orders, and the band began to move swiftly away from the smoking ruins of the wagons. Evelyn stumbled as she was dragged along, her shoes catching on stones. Behind her, the horizon swallowed the last remnants of her old life. Hours passed as they trekked into the wild country, into shadows of cliffs and valleys that seemed to fold endlessly into one another. Evelyn's body ached, her lips cracked with thirst, but she did not dare cry out. Each time she faltered, the warrior at her side tightened his grip and forced her forward. By nightfall, they reached a camp hidden deep in a canyon. Fires already burned there, casting flickering light over shelters of hides and brush. The sound of drums throbbed in the distance, echoing against the canyon walls. Evelyn's heart pounded like a trapped bird's. She had stepped into another world, a world that was not hers, where every face was foreign, every glance a judgment. Fear coiled in her belly, cold and unrelenting. She thought of her family, of the home she might never see again. She wanted to scream, to weep, to beg for release, but exhaustion smothered her voice. All she could do was stumble forward, her fate now bound to these strangers. Somewhere in that shifting circle of firelight, a figure stood watching her more intently than the rest. Broad-shouldered, silent, his eyes unreadable. The warrior did not move as she was led past. She felt his gaze burn into her, even as she lowered her head, trembling. Evelyn did not know it yet, but this man, this Apache warrior, would change the course of her life forever. The camp was alive with movement as twilight deepened into night. Children darted between the fires, women tended kettles, and men returned from the raid with the spoils of their victory. Horses snorted and stamped. The ground, their glossy coats shining beneath the flames. Evelyn, bound and weary, was pulled into the center of it all, her presence a curiosity among the tribe. Some of the women stared at her with sharp, appraising eyes. Others turned away, muttering words she could not understand. To them she was an outsider, a pale and frightened girl with dust tangled in her hair and a ripped dress hanging from her shoulders. A few boys snickered, emboldened by her helplessness, until an elder barked something that sent them scattering. Evelyn's heart thudded. She was no longer Evelyn Harper, daughter of a settler family. She was something less, something owned. The warriors gathered near a great fire, their voices rising in a cadence that reminded her of thunder rolling across mountains. They spoke quickly, with gestures sharp and decisive. Though she could not grasp the meaning, she understood enough. They were deciding her fate. Her stomach churned as her eyes darted from one face to another. Would they kill her? Sell her? Use her? Her gaze snagged again on the tall warrior who had watched her earlier. He stood a little apart from the others, arms folded across his chest, his expression unreadable in the shifting light. His hair, black and long, caught the glow of the fire. His face was strong, cut by shadows. When another warrior spoke his name, Taji, the circle seemed to turn toward him. Heads nodded, orders were given, and just like that, Evelyn was thrust forward. The warrior gripping her arm shoved her closer to the tall man, then stepped back. Taji looked down at her, his dark eyes fixed, searching. She shrank beneath his gaze, trembling though he had not touched her. At length, he spoke a few curt words, then untied the rawhide binding her wrists. Her arms dropped limply at her sides. Aching from hours of restraint, relief surged through her, mingled with a deeper fear. Why release her bonds? Did it mean trust, or something far worse? She rubbed her raw wrists, avoiding his eyes. Taji motioned for her to follow. His movements were measured, deliberate, without haste. He neither yanked her forward nor shoved her back into the crowd, only walked with the certainty of a man accustomed to obedience. Evelyn trailed him, hesitant, like a lamb led away from the flock. They crossed the camp until they reached a smaller lodge set near the canyon wall. A fire smoldered low at its entrance, and furs were laid neatly inside. Taji gestured for her to enter. For a long moment, Evelyn froze at the threshold. Everything in her cried out to run, but where could she go? The desert stretched endless and merciless beyond the canyon, and even if she fled, she would not survive the night. Slowly, unwillingly, she stepped inside. The lodge smelled of smoke, leather, and earth. Its walls were lined with weapons, bows, lances, knives, all tools that spoke of a life built on survival. Taji followed her in, his tall frame filling the space with a presence she could not ignore. He said something in his language, his tone even, but she shook her head. I don't understand. Her voice cracked. For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then he moved to the hearth, adding wood to the fire. Sparks leapt upward, painting his face in amber light. He glanced at her again, studying her not as prey but as something else, something unspoken. Evelyn could not read his thoughts, but she felt the weight of his restraint, the control in every gesture. At last, he spread a blanket on the ground near the fire and pointed to it. "Sleep," he said, his voice low but clear in the one English. Word he knew, her breath caught. Was it a command? A kindness? Both? She lowered herself onto the blanket, pulling it tightly around her shoulders. The warmth of the fire eased her shivering, though fear still clawed at her chest. Taji settled a short distance away, his back against the lodge wall, a knife resting across his knees. He did not close his eyes. In that stillness, Evelyn realized something. She was not a prisoner of the tribe, not exactly. She was his prisoner, his responsibility, his choice. And though he had spoken only one word to her, it was enough to unsettle her completely. Sleep did not come easily. Every time she drifted, she startled awake, her gaze finding him still there, silent and watchful. She could not decide which frightened her more, that he might move closer, or that he never would. The fire inside the lodge sputtered low, its smoke curling lazily toward the small vent above. Evelyn sat wrapped in the blanket, her knees drawn tight to her chest, every muscle taut with unease. Outside, the night was alive with sounds. The distant thrum of drums, the rise and fall of voices in a rhythm that was both alien and mesmerizing. She had heard hymns back east, sung in small wooden churches where voices trembled with devotion. But this was different. This was fierce, pulsing, like the heartbeat of the desert itself. Every beat of the drum made her flinch. Every echo reminded her she was far from the world she had known, surrounded by people who might decide at any moment she was of no use to them. She tried not to cry, pressing her face against her knees, biting her lip until she tasted blood. Crying was weakness, and weakness, she feared, would only make her more vulnerable. Across the lodge, Taji sat still as stone, his back rested against the wall, his eyes half-shadowed in the firelight. His posture was relaxed, yet there was a tension about him, like a bowstring drawn but not released. The knife still lay across his knees, glinting whenever the flames leapt. He had not spoken again since bidding her sleep, yet his silence was no comfort. It was worse. He was unreadable, unmovable, watching with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Evelyn shifted beneath the blanket, her breath quickening. She could not rest, not under that gaze, not knowing what his next move might be. At last, unable to bear the silence, she whispered, "Please, please don't hurt me." Her voice trembled, the words small, swallowed by the fire's crackle. For a moment she thought he hadn't heard. Then his dark eyes flicked toward her, sharp and focused. His expression did not change, yet something in it, something quiet, almost human, softened. He said nothing, but the knife remained still across his lap. Her chest rose and fell, quick, shallow. She tried again. "Don't touch me." This time her voice was steadier, though tears welled in her eyes. She hated herself for showing fear, but she could not keep the words back. Taji did not move. Instead, he shifted his gaze to the fire, as if granting her request by his very stillness. For a long moment, he simply stared into the flames, his jaw set. Then he reached forward, not toward her, but toward the woodpile, lifting a log and laying it gently across the embers. Sparks danced, and the light grew stronger. His fingers brushed the edge of the blanket near her shoulder as he adjusted it, but when she flinched and whispered, "No," he froze instantly. His hand hovered for a breath, then withdrew. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned back to his place by the wall. The restraint in that gesture struck her more deeply than words could have. He could have forced her. He could have claimed the power his strength and her weakness offered him. Yet he hadn't. Her heart pounded, confused, torn between lingering fear and the faintest spark of relief. Minutes stretched into hours. The fire settled into glowing embers. Outside, the drums quieted, replaced by the occasional laugh, a horse's whinny, a child's cry. The camp was settling, yet inside the lodge, Evelyn remained wide-eyed, trembling beneath the blanket. Her thoughts circled endlessly, of her mother's arms slipping from hers, of her father's last shout, of the wagon wheels cracking, of smoke and arrows and blood. Grief pressed against her throat, thick and suffocating, but she swallowed it back. To weep here before him felt too dangerous. At last, exhaustion began to tug at her, Her eyelids drooped despite her effort to stay vigilant. She told herself she would not sleep, that she could not trust him, not even for a moment. But her body betrayed her. She drifted in and out, waking each time she felt the weight of his presence. And each time, she found him the same. Silent, unmoving, eyes watchful as if carved from the very stone of the canyon. It was not comfort, not safety, but it was something. When sleep finally claimed her, it was fitful, tangled with dreams of fire and shadow. And though she did not know it, the man called Taji did not close his eyes once. Through every hour of the night, he remained, there still and vigilant, guarding a captive who trembled beneath his blanket, whispering pleas into the darkness. Morning came slowly, announced not by the chirping of familiar sparrows, but by the haunting calls of canyon birds and the distant whinny of horses. A pale light filtered through the lodge's hide walls, faint at first, then brighter, painting the space in shades of gold and gray. Evelyn stirred beneath the blanket, her body stiff from the hard ground. For a moment she forgot where she was, until the smoke, the smell of leather, and the shadow of the warrior across the room rushed back to her. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. Taji was still there, seated against the wall, his posture unchanged. Had he sat awake the entire night? His eyes, dark and steady, met hers as she lifted her head. She looked away quickly, pulling the blanket tighter, as though it could shield her from his gaze. Her stomach twisted with hunger, her lips parched from thirst. She dared not ask for anything, yet her body betrayed her with a faint groan of emptiness. Taji rose then, fluid and quiet, and left the lodge without a word. Evelyn pressed her hand to her chest, exhaling a shudder of relief. Alone at last. But the relief was short-lived. Moments later he returned, carrying a wooden bowl of water and a strip of dried meat. He crouched near the fire, setting them down carefully. Then he glanced at her, just once, as though to say, "Take it." Evelyn hesitated. Hunger clawed at her, but so did fear. What if it was a trick? What if he was testing her obedience, her trembling? Hands finally reached out, taking the bowl. She sipped the water in small, desperate swallows, then nibbled the meat. Every movement felt watched, weighed, though Taji said nothing. When she finished, she set the bowl aside and sat frozen, unsure what to do. The silence pressed on her until it was unbearable. She whispered, "Thank you." He didn't answer, but a flicker of something passed over his face. A brief narrowing of his eyes, as if he recognized the word if not the meaning. Then, without warning, he reached toward her blanket. Her entire body tensed. His hand brushed the wool near her shoulder, tugging it slightly as if to adjust it or check the fire's warmth. Panic surged, her breath caught, her pulse pounding. She felt cornered, defenseless, the shadows of every terrible possibility rushing over her. No. The word escaped her lips, soft but urgent, a plea more than a command. Instantly, his fingers stopped. They hung there for a heartbeat, hovering at the edge of the fabric. His eyes flicked to hers, dark and searching. She couldn't read them, whether they carried anger, amusement, or something else entirely. Then, slowly, deliberately, he drew his hand back. The moment stretched between them, heavy with meaning. Her breath shook as she realized what had just passed. He had heard her plea. He had stopped. For a long while, neither spoke. Evelyn's mind whirled, trying to make sense of him. This man, this warrior who had taken her from her family, who held her fate in his hands, why show restraint? Why honor the trembling plea of a captive girl? Taji turned back to the fire, adding another log, his movements calm and methodical. He spoke a few words in his language, low, almost to himself, and she caught none of them. Still, the tone was not sharp, not cruel. Evelyn pressed her face into the blanket, tears welling at last. They slipped hot down her cheeks, soaking the wool. She hated herself for weeping in front of him, but the flood could not be stopped. Her fear, her grief, her exhaustion, all broke loose in that fragile instant after he had pulled his hand away. She thought he might mock her, or leave, or perhaps come closer. But Taji did none of those things. He sat again near the wall, silent as stone, the only sound the fire's crackle and her quiet sobbing. And though she could not have said why, that single pause, his fingers freezing at the edge of the blanket, changed something inside her. Just slightly. Just enough for her fear to mingle with something she hadn't expected. The faintest stirrings of trust. The firelight dimmed as the day grew brighter outside the lodge. Smoke curled lazily upward, carrying the bitter tang of ash into the air. Evelyn sat motionless beneath her blanket, eyes red from tears, watching the Apache warrior with guarded unease. She half expected his patience to snap, for him to punish her trembling refusal from the night before. But he didn't. He remained seated against the wall, his features carved into stillness, his presence commanding yet restrained. That restraint unsettled her more than anger might have. If he had shouted, struck her, or forced his will, she would have known how to respond, with terror, with hatred, with resistance. But this quiet control, this refusal to press beyond the boundary she had begged for, it confused her. It made her wonder if he was dangerous in a way she could not comprehend. At last, Taji rose to his feet. Evelyn stiffened as he crossed the lodge, but he only reached for the door flap. Before stepping outside, he looked back at her, his gaze steady, unreadable. Then he left, letting sunlight spill briefly into the room before it closed again. Alone, Evelyn pressed her hands to her face, trying to steady her breath. Her heart still pounded from the memory of his hand near her shoulder, the frozen pause. When she whispered, "No." Why had he stopped? Was it mercy, or only pride, the kind that made him choose the moment, not her? The minutes dragged until he returned, carrying a wooden pail of water. He set it down beside the fire, then motioned toward her. "Drink," he said, his voice low, his accent heavy. She hesitated, then obeyed, dipping her hands to bring water to her lips. It was cool, refreshing, almost sweet compared to the dust choking her throat. When she finished, she murmured, "Thank you," though she doubted he understood. Still, his eyes lingered on her as if weighing the intent of her tone. The day passed in fragments. He came and went, sometimes leaving her alone for stretches, sometimes watching in silence. Other warriors entered the lodge once, speaking with him in voices sharp and clipped, but he dismissed them with a curt gesture. Evelyn understood nothing of the words exchanged, but she caught the way his jaw tightened, the authority in his bearing. He was not merely a guard set over her, he had claimed responsibility for her. That realization chilled her. She was not free. She was tethered to his choices, his whims, his restraint. And restraint, she reminded herself, was a fragile thing. Dusk crept back across the canyon. The drums began again outside. Fires flared, laughter and voices rising. Inside, Taji stirred the embers of their small hearth, his movements quiet, unhurried. Evelyn sat curled in her blanket, exhausted but restless, her nerves stretched thin. She dared another whisper. "Why me?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. Her voice cracked with the weight of her question. Why had she been spared when others had not? Why had he stopped when she begged him? Taji's head lifted, his dark eyes fixed on her, piercing, steady. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke, but the words were in his tongue, slow and deliberate. She couldn't understand, but the tone, low, firm, almost gentle, held no threat. It wasn't an answer, not one she could grasp. But something in the cadence quieted her trembling. Later, when night thickened, she lay down again near the fire. Sleep hovered at the edge of her reach, but fear kept her awake. Each time she shifted, she found his gaze already on her, as if he never truly rested. Finally, when exhaustion overpowered even fear, she slipped into uneasy slumber. The last thing she saw was him seated there in the half-light, knife across his knees, eyes unblinking, watching, waiting, and Evelyn understood. This much. It wasn't his strength that terrified her most. It was his restraint. Because restraint, if ever broken, would fall like a storm she could not survive. The second morning dawned warmer, the canyon walls glowing like embers under the rising sun. Evelyn awoke to the low murmur of voices outside the lodge, the scent of smoke and roasted maize drifting in. Her body ached from the hard ground, her lips dry, but it was hunger that twisted her stomach most sharply. She had eaten almost nothing since her capture. Taji entered then, parting the flap of the lodge. Sunlight framed him for a heartbeat before he stepped inside, carrying a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. Evelyn shrank back automatically, clutching the blanket close. His movements, though, were slow, deliberate, without threat. He crouched near the fire, unwrapped the bundle, and revealed pieces of roasted corn and a thick cake of ground meal. Her eyes widened. Food. He set it down between them, then looked at her. "Eat," he said, his tone flat, but not unkind. Evelyn hesitated. The memory of the raid still burned in her, men falling, cries silenced. How could she accept food from the hands of the enemy? Yet her body begged for it, her hands trembling. Finally, she reached forward, her eyes never leaving his. She half expected him to snatch it away, to laugh at her desperation. But he didn't. He simply sat back on his heels and watched. The first bite nearly made her cry. It was coarse and simple, but it filled her mouth with warmth, easing the sharp ache in her belly. She ate slowly at first, then more eagerly, until the small meal was gone. She wiped her hands against the blanket, ashamed at her hunger, but unable to hide the relief that softened her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Taji tilted his head slightly, as though studying her. He didn't reply, but his eyes, dark, steady, seemed to acknowledge the sentiment, even if he didn't know the words. When she lowered her gaze, he rose and moved to the lodge flap. He spoke a few words in his own tongue to someone outside. Moments later, a younger boy entered carrying a clay jug of water. Taji accepted it, dismissed the boy, then poured some into a carved cup. He offered it to her, not by forcing it into her hands, but by placing it within her reach. Another kindness. Evelyn drank, the water cool against her parched throat. She couldn't reconcile this with the image she had of warriors as merciless raiders. Last night he had stopped when she pleaded, and now he gave her food and water without demand. Her heart still raced in his presence, yet some part of her began to doubt the image of monster she had built in her mind. As the day stretched on, she noticed other small gestures. When the sun grew harsh, he shifted the lodge flap to shield her from its glare. When she stumbled outside under his watch, her legs unsteady, he steadied her arm only long enough to keep her from falling, then released her at once. There was no lingering touch, no cruelty in his grip. Always he gave just enough, and nothing more. It unsettled her more than harshness would have. She had expected to hate him, to shrink from every gesture. Instead, she found herself wondering what lay behind his silence, why he offered her these mercies when he owed her none. That night, when the drums outside the camp grew wild and the fires burned tall, Taji returned to the lodge and placed another blanket at her side. She looked at it, then at him. He said nothing, only turned back to the fire. Her throat tightened. It was such a small thing. an extra blanket against the cold desert night. But it was the first gift she had been given since her capture. She clutched it close, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. For the first time since the attack, Evelyn lay down and let her eyes close without fighting the pull of sleep. Her body, worn and weary, surrendered to rest. And through the flickering light of the fire, she sensed him still there, silent, watchful, his restraint wrapped now in something she had not expected at all: kindness. The days blurred into one another, each marked by the steady rhythm of camp life. At first, Evelyn counted them with dread, certain that every sunrise meant she was one day closer to some unknown, inevitable end. But soon, something else began to take root. Her fear remained, sharp and insistent, but it no longer stood alone. Alongside it, almost against her will, grew a fragile thread of curiosity. Taji never spoke much. He was a man of silence, his words carefully measured, his movements deliberate, yet his presence wove itself into every hour of her captivity. When she stumbled while walking across the uneven canyon floor, his hand caught her elbow just long enough to steady her before releasing. When she struggled to drink from the heavy clay jug, he showed her how to tilt it without spilling. And, when the night air grew cold, he always made sure the fire burned high enough to keep her warm. These were not gestures of affection, at least not as Evelyn understood them. They were practical, restrained, and at times almost distant, but each one chipped away at the wall of terror she had built around herself. One afternoon, as the sun beat down on the camp, she sat near the lodge entrance, watching children chase one another with shrill laughter. Their games reminded her of home, of her younger cousins splashing in creeks, of summer evenings where the air hummed with crickets and safety felt certain. The memory ached in her chest, both sweet and unbearable. Taji approached then, carrying a bundle of wood. He set it by the fire, then crouched near her. His eyes studied her face for a long moment, and she dropped her gaze, embarrassed by the wetness in her eyes. He spoke a word softly, almost tentative. "Ta Shudi?" She blinked, not understanding. He tried again, tapping his chest lightly, then repeating the word with slow clarity. Realization dawned. He was asking her something. "Name?" she whispered, pointing to herself. His lips twitched, almost like the shadow of a smile. He nodded once. "Taji," he said, tapping his chest again. Her mouth went dry. This was the first time he had offered her more than a command, or a single English word. He had given her his name. She hesitated, then pressed her hand to her chest. "Evelyn." His brow furrowed as he tried to shape the syllables. "A.V. Lynn." The roughness of his accent bent the sound strangely, but hearing her name from his lips made her chest tighten with something she couldn't name. Over the days that followed, small exchanges grew between them. He taught her simple words in his language: water, fire, sky, pointing and repeating until she understood. In return, she traced letters in the dust, showing him how her language looked on the page. He studied her marks with the same intensity he gave to the stars at night, silent but absorbing. It was not friendship, not yet. The memory of blood and fire still separated them, and her heart clenched every time she remembered her mother's last cry. Yet she could no longer deny that something was shifting between them. One evening, as she sat with her blanket around her shoulders, he handed her a piece of leather cord strung with a small carved bead. She stared at it, bewildered. A gift? She hesitated to take it, but his gaze held no command, only quiet expectation. Slowly, she reached out and accepted it. Her fingers trembled as she held it, feeling the smooth surface of the bead. It was plain, yet she knew it meant something, perhaps a sign of protection, perhaps of claim. She whispered, "Thank you." Taji said nothing, but for the first time when their eyes met, she felt the barest spark of something that frightened her more than captivity itself, the possibility of trust. And so the days passed, not with ease, but with a slow, reluctant weaving of two lives caught in the same net of fate. The canyon nights grew colder as the moon waned, and Evelyn often found herself huddled close to the fire, the bead on its cord clutched tight in her hand. Days had blurred into weeks, and though she still longed for freedom, her fear of Taji had shifted into something far more complicated. He had not harmed her. He had not pressed beyond what she could bear. Instead, he lingered at the edges of her world, steady, watchful, and, though she could hardly admit it, even protective. It was during one of those long nights that the silence between them finally cracked open. The camp had quieted, children long asleep, the last echoes of laughter fading into the canyon walls. Evelyn sat tracing letters in the dirt with a stick, spelling her name again and again, as though to remind herself who she was. Evelyn Harper. Evelyn Harper. If she could still write it, still remember it, then perhaps she had not been erased by all that had happened. Taji sat across from her, sharpening a knife with slow, methodical strokes. She had grown used to the sound, a rhythm that no longer chilled her. When his gaze shifted to the marks she had made in the dust, he set the knife aside and leaned forward. "What?" "This?" he asked, his English hesitant, broken. She blinked at him, surprised he had tried. "My name," she whispered, pointing to the letters. "Evelyn." He studied the symbols with the intensity of a man reading the stars. Then he shook, his head slightly. "Marks, like path?" "Yes," she said, warming to the rare chance for exchange. "Like a path. Each letter, one step." She pointed to each symbol. E, V, E, L, Y, N. He repeated the sounds, awkward but earnest. When he stumbled over V, she found herself smiling despite the heaviness in her chest. "Close," she encouraged softly. For a long moment he was silent. Then he pressed a finger into the dirt and drew a shape of his own. Not a letter, but a simple form, a line of jagged peaks. "Mountain," he said in his own tongue. Then he tapped his chest. "Taji." Her breath caught. "Your name means mountain?" He nodded once, eyes steady on hers. It was the first time she had been given a glimpse into who he was beyond the warrior, beyond the silence. The name fit. Him. Immovable, unyielding, carved by time and storms. Something shifted then, and she dared to ask, "Why take me? Why spare me?" The question hung heavy in the air. For a long while, she thought he would not answer. His jaw tightened, his gaze sliding to the fire as if searching the flames for words. When he finally spoke, it was not in English, but in his own tongue, low, measured, heavy with weight. She shook her head helplessly. "I don't understand." He drew a breath, then tried again in broken English. "Your people." He gestured outward toward the horizon. "They come. Kill. Take." His voice hardened, rough with pain. He pressed a hand to his chest. "My mother, my brother, dead." Evelyn froze. His eyes glinted in the firelight, and for the first time, she saw not only the warrior, but the man beneath, the grief carved deep, the wound that had never closed. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though the words felt too small. He shook his head sharply, as if brushing away pity. Yet the silence that followed was not as heavy as before. It was different. An acknowledgement, a fragile thread strung between them. For the first time, Evelyn saw that she was not the only one carrying loss. They were both marked by grief, caught on opposite sides of a war neither had chosen. She turned back to the letters in the dust, tracing her name again, her hand trembling. When she looked up, his gaze was still on her. Not harsh, not cold, just steady. Watching, as though seeing her for the first time not as a captive, but as someone who also had wounds unseen. That night, as the fire burned low, Evelyn lay awake beneath her blanket, the bead warm against her arm. Her fear had not vanished, but now it was laced with something new, something dangerous, understanding. The moon was thin, the night Evelyn first saw her chance. The camp had quieted after a long day of hunting and work. Fires smoldered low, warriors' voices faded into the canyon shadows, and most of the tribe lay in sleep. Evelyn lay awake beneath, her blanket, her heart restless, her mind turning over and over. Weeks had passed since her capture, and though her body still carried fear, her heart had shifted in ways she had not expected. Taji had not harmed her. More than that, he had fed her, guarded her, spoken to her in words broken but earnest. He had given her his name, and he had listened when she gave him hers. She had seen pain etched into his soul, grief as sharp as her own. But she was not free. She reminded herself of this with every breath. She was a prisoner, no matter how gently the bars had been forged. That night, as the canyon wind carried whispers through the lodge flap, Evelyn noticed something unusual. Taji was gone. His place near the fire sat empty, his knife absent from its resting place. For the first time since her capture, she was alone. Her pulse quickened. She pushed herself up, every sense straining. Outside, only a few embers glowed, the camp eerily still. Beyond the canyon walls stretched desert and sky, harsh, endless but open, freedom. Her first step was tentative, her bare feet silent on the lodge floor. She lifted the flap slowly, her breath caught in her throat. No one stirred. The horses stood tethered near the edge of camp, stamping occasionally, their dark shapes half hidden. Beyond them lay the open land, vast and waiting. Her heart thundered. She could run. She could find her way back to settlers, to safety, to what little remained of the life she had lost. The thought of her mother's face, her father's last shout, surged through her, and tears pricked her eyes. She had to try. But as she stepped into the cool night, her body froze. She thought of Taji's eyes, steady and solemn, as he pulled his hand back from her blanket when she pleaded no. She thought of the carved bead he had given her, a gift small yet inexplicably weighty. She thought of his voice, rough with grief, when he told her of his brother, his mother, taken by settlers like hers, had been taken by warriors. Her chest tightened painfully. To leave meant freedom. To stay meant what? She didn't even have a name for it. Trust, bond, a fragile tether between two lives carved by violence. She lifted her hand to her neck, clutching the bead. Its smooth surface pressed into her palm, grounding her. For a long moment, she stood torn between two paths, the familiar world of her people, or the unknown path bound to a man who had stolen her but never broken her. Then a sound broke the silence. Footsteps. She turned quickly. Taji emerged from the shadows carrying a bundle of wood. His eyes landed on her instantly, standing at the edge of the lodge, her face pale in the moonlight, her body half turned toward escape. The moment froze between them. His gaze did not blaze with anger, nor soften with sorrow. It was steady, unreadable, but heavy with understanding. Evelyn's breath came fast, her body trembling. He said nothing, only set the wood down and straightened. For a long moment they stood locked in silence, the desert stretching endlessly around them, freedom just steps away. And in that silence, she realized something terrifying. She could have run. She still could. But her feet did not move, not because of fear, not because of weakness, but because her heart traitorous, trembling, was no longer certain which world she wanted more. The air was sharp with silence after Taji caught her at the lodge's edge. Evelyn's chest heaved, her fingers still gripping the bead at her throat. His eyes did not leave hers, and though he said nothing, she felt the weight of the question pressing between them. Would you have gone? She lowered her gaze, ashamed. Of the answer she didn't fully know herself. She could not run, yet she could not explain why. Taji set down the bundle of wood and stepped closer, his movements unhurried but certain. She braced, expecting anger, but instead he only pulled the lodge flap aside for her, motioning her back in. His restraint was as steady as ever, but his gaze lingered on her as if measuring every breath she took. She obeyed, sinking onto her blanket near the fire. He joined her, silent, sharpening his knife as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. It was later that night, when the camp had quieted again, that the true test came. A group of warriors entered the lodge, without warning, led by a broad-shouldered man with sharp, hawk-like features. Evelyn startled, pulling her blanket close. The intruders spoke in quick, clipped tones, their eyes cutting toward her. Though she could not understand the words, the meaning was unmistakable. They were demanding something. Her. Taji rose slowly, setting his knife aside, his height casting a shadow that filled the space. His voice was low, firm, unyielding as stone. Evelyn watched, her heart hammering, as the other man snarled back, pointing toward her with an impatient hand. Her stomach turned to ice. They want me. They want to take me away from him. The hawk-faced warrior stepped closer, his hand brushing the hilt of his weapon. Taji blocked his path with the full force of his presence, his shoulders squared, his eyes burning with a warning Evelyn did not need translated. The air crackled with tension, every breath thick with the possibility of violence. The other man spat words like fire, his voice rising, his hand gesturing sharply. Evelyn flinched, clutching her blanket tighter. Then, suddenly, the warrior lunged forward, reaching for her arm. She cried out, but before the hand could touch her, Taji's fist struck like thunder. The man staggered back, blood springing. From his lip, the entire lodge erupting in shouts. For a heartbeat, chaos threatened to spill into bloodshed. But Taji stood his ground, his voice ringing out in a deep command. His words were like stone crashing against stone, unyielding, final. The other warriors hesitated, then muttered among themselves. The hawk-faced man spat blood into the dirt, glaring, but he did not press further. One by one, they withdrew, their mutters fading into the night. Evelyn sat frozen, her body trembling. She could hardly believe what had just happened. He had fought for her, protected her, chosen her, not as property, but as something worth defending. Taji turned then, his chest rising and falling, his jaw tight. His eyes softened only slightly, as they met hers. No words passed his lips, but none were needed. The meaning was clear in the set of his shoulders, in the steadiness of his gaze. You are mine to protect. Evelyn's breath came fast. Her heart caught between terror and something deeper, something that frightened her even more than fear itself. Because in that moment, she understood that her whispered no on the first night had not only saved her, it had begun something. A bond, a thread, a choice she could no longer deny. And as the fire flickered between them, Evelyn realized with a shiver that she no longer knew where her captivity ended and her own heart began.